And despite what my colleague said a little while ago, it's really a pleasure for me to be with an audience that is so decidedly not mediocre. So if there are some mediocre people you can meet with, Bill, later on and discuss that. I want to talk about SRI from the moral standpoint, and I think before I'm through I may distress most people in the audience, so forgive me for that. I have some good things and some bad things to say about that. As Catholic, as a Christian, I think our starting point in considering these things is very important. And the starting point, two starting points, I think, are the notion of gift and the notion of stewardship. The concept of gift calls us to acknowledge that what we possess is not entirely our own. It's not ours to use simply at our discretion. Instead, everything we possess, wealth, talents, opportunities, education, good looks, all of this, these things are gifts from God, and they're to be used in collaboration with Him for His purposes. Now, His purposes include the transcendent destiny that you and I have, but they include other things besides just me. The concept of stewardship calls us to accountability. I want to remind you of the parable of the talents. Anybody know a talent is a measure of weight in the ancient world? Anyone know how much a talent weighs, roughly? That's not a weight. That's a different kind of measure. How much did it weigh in pounds? Take a guess. About 60 pounds. One of the servants was given 5 talents of gold. It's about $7.5 million by today's measures. Now, think about that just in this regard. That would have shocked Jesus' audience. 5 talents in gold was a sum that the ordinary people who would have been listening to Jesus couldn't even imagine. Okay? A talent of silver was a year's wage. A talent of gold, hugely beyond that. 5 talents of gold. Remember what happened? 2 of the servants went off and invested it. See, he's giving investment advice. They went off and invested it. One buried it in his backyard, came back later and said, see, I didn't lose it. And that was the one who was rejected. It's interesting. That parable, I find it interesting, occurs in Matthew chapter 25. Immediately following is Jesus' discussion about the kingdom of heaven, separating the sheep from the goats, those who care for the least among you, and so on and so on. Think about that in terms of the responsibility and the accountability for investing. A steward is responsible, first of all, for protecting whatever is in his care, but he's secondly responsible for using it well. And I think this has to do with the meaning of the parables in Matthew 25. Question for investors, I think, then, will be one of discernment. I appreciate the point about investments being something much broader than simply equities or bonds. They can consist in all sorts of things of value. The question for discernment is, how do I use what I have available to me in concrete circumstances to further God's ends? Discernment always involves trying to figure out what God wants us to do. Institutional investors and private investors are going to answer this question somewhat differently. But in both cases, the obligation goes beyond simply avoiding cooperation with evil. That's the third servant in the parable of the talents. I'm not going to cooperate with evil. I'm going to bury it in the backyard and I'll be all right. Well, that's not the world in which we live. One of my colleagues has talked about the difficulties in sorting out some questions, but you know we're used to difficulties in sorting out questions. We have a whole profession of law, we have law courts and so on, and they're sorting out complicated questions. We ought not to be put off by that. They're not as complicated as they seem. Perhaps we can talk later a little bit about formal and material cooperation. From a Catholic perspective, let me suggest that a socially responsible investment or investing project might have 4 characteristics. First of all, it would begin with a clear understanding of the common good of a civil society. This is a very ambiguous term these days. In our tradition, Pope John the 23rd defined it very carefully, Mater Magistra, paragraph 65, as a set of conditions that makes it possible for each and every individual in the community to sustain and establish and seek his own flourishing. It's an instrumental good, it's not a final good. The progressive misunderstand social justice, which is synonymous with the common good, as a kind of final good, as a circumstance in which everyone is actually flourishing, not in which we've established the conditions for that flourishing. We have a different view. Secondly, I think a socially responsible investing project would seek to promote some concrete aspect of the common good, not merely avoid harming it. I think many SRI funds simply focus on avoiding complicity with certain kinds of harms. We need to do much more than that. Third, it would allow and prompt businesses to do what business does well and not steer business into politics. Social responsibility has a different meaning in Europe. In the United States, corporate social responsibility is often meant using corporate assets to address social problems. And typically it gets a business outside its ordinary sphere of operations and so on. I don't think that's necessary. We had to get business to do what business does well, and there are at least three things that business can do well when it serves the community. It creates good work and sustains good work. It creates products and services, to quote a recent document from the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. It creates goods that are truly good and services that truly serve. And the third thing it does is create wealth and see to its fair distribution. That's pretty good, I think. I think it's a pretty good contribution to society. This is, by the way, consistent, socially responsible investments would be entirely consistent with encouraging and prompting and compelling business to sustain better management practices, better relationships with employees, better product development, and so on and so on. And lastly, I think a good socially responsible investment project would develop measures of success and strategies for correcting failures. I think very few SRI funds actually look at the impact that they have and make some determinations about what they could do to improve. Do I think SRI funds are bad products? No, I don't think they're bad products, but I think most of them are inadequate. They have a tendency to have a very limited, even confused understanding of Catholic values. There are a whole range of them, you know that better than I. Some of them will say, will avoid companies that engage in abortion. Okay, so out of a universe of thousands of equities available, how many companies do you suppose that is? Probably count them on one hand, maybe two. That's not a very effective screen. Sometimes they have what I call faux Catholic values. They think that somehow or another the church is committed to something and it's really their own preferences. Sometimes they exaggerate certain things. I think we should be concerned about issues of gender equality and fairness, but I also think, and many funds list that, ensuring a certain kind of equality on boards of directors, men and women, but I don't think it's quite as important as life issues and a number of other issues that we could address, and I think some funds get those things mixed up. Beyond avoiding some cooperation with evil, which you can't really do in this life, and apart from occasional efforts at shareholder activism, I really think SRI funds have little impact on the common good. As a banker friend of mine likes to say, they may be more about marketing than they are about social impact. They generally have little capacity, in my experience, to investigate for their values. In other words, we can talk about investing in companies that have good employee relationships. Well, okay, how are you going to investigate that? How are you going to sustain that? Are you going to come back and look at them a year from now, 2 years from now? What are you going to look for? How are you going to measure it? I think very many of those funds have really no capacity to do that, or for that matter, to track compliance. Are they sustaining the values that attracted you to them in the first place? I think it's possible to do better, I really do. But if we're going to do better, it's going to require some collaborations. It's going to be a collaboration with people outside the world of finance. It's not always going to be easy, it's going to be complicated, but we're used to doing complicated things, and we can do them well.